A North Korean attack on Guam would be suicidal according to experts, with the full force of the U.S. military ready to react to any provocation. Today the reclusive nation threatened to launch 4 intermediate-range missiles at the U.S. territory of Guam by mid-August, with a plan of attack to be tabled to leader Kim Jong-un. And while the rhetoric has grown increasingly violent, a leading expert on the region says it can only end badly if North Korea carries out its latest threats. If we're going to be realistic about it, if the DPRK was going to launch a preemptive missile attack, it would be suicidal because the retaliation would be so enormous the North Korean leadership and much of the civilian population would not fare very well, Dr. Adam Broinowski told 9.com.au. The regime's crosshairs are lingering on Guam in response to U.S. President Donald Trump's fire and fury comments. Tens of thousands of North Koreans gathered for a rally at Kim Il-sung Square carrying placards and propaganda slogans as a show of support for the rejection of the United Nations' latest round of sanctions on Wednesday, August 9, 2017, in Pyongyang, North Korea. Photo John Chol Jin Trump escalated the war of words with Kim Jong-un after a report surfaced that claimed North Korea had miniaturized a nuclear weapon and could load warheads onto missiles. What the North Koreans have said, they're very specific. They would use 4 IRBMs, which are intermediate-range ballistic missiles, to target 1,824 miles off the coast of Guam, said Dr. Broinowski, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Anu College of Asia and the Pacific. That means that should they decide to carry it out, which they aren't decided on yet, that would mean it would primarily target U.S. military installations, namely Navy forces and Air Force bombers that are capable of attacking North Korea with nuclear and non-nuclear missiles. He said what North Korea is saying is, we know you have these weapons, you've been drilling the use of them for years now on North Korean territory, and we are promising to target those military installations, not civilian populations in South Korea and Japan. Dr. Broinowski said about 163,000 people live on Guam, so any attack would also come with significant human casualties. The August deadline also has loaded connotations, according to Dr. Broinowski. That is close to a U.S. annual military drill, which I think is at the end of August. They may be suggesting a warning: we might conduct this strike if you are serious about conducting a strike on us. As per Trump's words of fire and fury, what U.S. retaliation might look like in terms of how the U.S. might retaliate, Professor Andrew O'Neill, the Dean of Research at the Griffith Business School, said it all depends on the nature of North Korea's attack on Guam. If it's a case of missiles flashing down in the sea around Guam, you would see serious ramping up of U.S. air and naval assets in the region, he said. Guam itself is home to an airport base, which is a base for deployed US B-1 and other strike assets in the region. The Americans can reinforce those assets from the continental US, including with nuclear assets, B-52s and B-2s. So the Americans can crank things up pretty quickly if they choose, but if the strike hits territory on Guam, all bets would be off, Professor O'Neill said. The US would very quickly settle on what's known as flexible deterrent options, he said. The American military and the president as commander-in-chief have a list of orders they can require the military to execute. That can range from taking out North Korean vessels in the region, striking North Korean airfields, right up to striking the central command of Pyongyang. Americans have a lot of options, they have a lot of firepower. The big question in all of this is whether they risk igniting a major conflict, a war with North Korea, or potentially one with China if it escalates to that level. Professor Andrew O'Neill has said the threat against Guam is credible, supplied. Professor O'Neill has said the threat against Guam is credible. They have tended to follow through on statements of intent in the past. It would be a mistake to treat it as an idle threat, he told 9.com.au. North Koreans do exaggerate their role in the world and threats, but on the other hand, when they have promised to carry out something, they generally have delivered. The world is watching for Dr. Broinowski. The unfortunate aspect of Trump's rhetoric of fire and fury is it is making China and Russia appear quite conciliatory and look like the international statespeople in the room. They are arguing for maximum restraint, freeze for freeze. If North Korea freezes its nuclear weapons program in return for the US freezing its US rock military drills and threats, then we can come to the table and start discussing a nuclear weapons-free zone in Northeast Asia. We can discuss how to denuclearize the region and North Korea in particular, he said. What you have is China and Russia seemingly, all of a sudden, much more reasonable, using diplomatic language, talking actual concrete ways of getting out of this problem, instead of ratcheting up all the time. They're actually providing a real roadmap to achieve that kind of outcome. Whereas what Trump is doing is inflammatory, escalating and endangering everyone, not really the behavior of a global leader, Dr. Andrew Broinowski supplied. And for Australia, according to Dr. Broinowski, this is a problem. We're wedded to this bully in the room. Australia really needs to consider what position we're going to take, maybe a bit more independence, he said. However, Professor O'Neill argues Trump has handled the situation pretty well. The fire and fury comments have been condemned, but you can look at it and say, oh well, he basically had a gutful of getting nuclear threats from what he sees as a tin pot dictatorship. He's going to lash out and say something like that, he said. On the other hand, the problem with that statement is if the North Koreans do something highly provocative and he doesn't respond, that really runs the risk of eroding American credibility. Copyright 9 Digital Pty Limited 2017.